With the impetus provided by NCOP that Michael mentioned before and the increased emphasis on participation as well as access, these are exciting times in WP, and we're therefore particularly pleased to have Chris Millward with us, the Director for Fair Access and Participation at the all-new Office for Students. So here to navigate a path for us in this time of restructuring and new opportunities, please welcome Chris Millward.
Okay, thanks all of you for coming, and thanks to Causeway for inviting me. I'm very pleased to see the theme of partnership in the conference. If you look across the student life cycle from access through to progression into work, student success is really achieved by universities' increasingly in-depth partnerships, not just with schools but also with employers, and that's going to be a key theme in our work. Charities like Causeway, I think, are becoming an increasingly dynamic link in those partnerships, and we're interested in how that can develop into the future. I've been in government long enough to hear partnership talked about as a kind of vague benefit in itself, and I would say it's really crucial that the notion of partnership translates into carefully planned, evidentially targeted and robustly evaluated activities with very clear and demonstrable benefits from students. So great to see, I guess, the common theme in the two sessions I've been here for this morning being evidence, using evidence to understand what we might do and evaluating that and feeding that back into what we do, and that'll be a key theme in what I'm going to talk about over the next 25 minutes or so. So three parts to what I'm going to talk about. So why is access and participation in higher education important? What's the current position? How do we think we're doing? Picking up on some of the things Michael's just said. And then how is the Office for Students going to work with universities, charities, schools and employers on all of this? So if I start with the first, it's often said that there is greater division in public life and more divergent opinions in public life than there has been for some time. But one of the things I think you can have to travel quite a long way to find people who disagree with the notion of social mobility and equal opportunity, that everyone should have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves, to unlock their potential, regardless of where they come from. And there's a strong theme there, picking up what people have talked about already, about addressing the gap between talent across the nation and opportunity in society as it currently stands. Of course, the case for this is made in terms of improving individual life chances, unlocking potential, equipping people for the world of the future, including changes such as automation, social cohesion by improving the prospects of the least advantaged and minority groups, but also crucially and not least given Brexit, a productive economy, successful public services, securing the highly skilled workforce that's needed both now and into the future. Higher education is, of course, positioned centrally within all of this. It's framed as an engine of social mobility. It is, picking up on things that have been said by Robert, especially this morning, a good life in itself. Education is terrifically stimulating and valuable in its own terms, but it's also, of course, a gateway beyond that. It provides knowledge, experiences and friendships that are valuable in their own terms, but also crucially skills, credentials and contacts beyond that. I'm very aware from having done this for a couple of months that this is most commonly depicted, if you debate higher education and social mobility, it is most commonly depicted as a residential experience of higher education, progression to an elite profession, and indeed very mobile lives and careers. And that is crucially important, and it's an important dimension of our work. But I'm clear also, not least from meeting students, that it's just as important for higher education to improve lives of people who want to study at home, who want to work in the community they grew up in, and indeed may enter higher education later in life. So we need to kind of ride both those horses rather than just focusing on the first. So HE can be a powerful force for social mobility and equal opportunity. How are we doing on it? Well, most of you watched the London Marathon on Sunday. You'll have seen how difficult it was. From my perspective, if we're running the London Marathon, we're kind of at Tower Bridge. So we've made decent progress. We're through the first half, but we actually not least given what Michael was showing earlier on. We have to take the tougher steps that will mean that we can finish the race. But I'm absolutely clear if we can do that, it will be the most rewarding thing that the OFS certainly could do. So let me explain that a bit further. We've had 2 decades of widening participation activity, which many of you have been involved with. Funding from HEFGE, financial support negotiated with Offer, increasing investment, particularly in outreach, through the access agreements. Alongside that, we've had expansion of the system. So shifting teaching grant into government-backed loans, removing student number controls. That's been a key force in improving access to undergraduate education in particular. And so, as we've seen already, there are more young people from the most underrepresented groups in higher education than ever before, and indeed the fastest growing group is among ethnic minority students. There are, though, and we've seen this in the chart that you saw in the earlier session, the gaps are not particularly reducing. You're still twice as likely to go into higher education if you're from the most underrepresented group, and that gap in the highest tariff institutions is more than 5 times. And of course, that's all the more dramatic once you start layering in different categorizations of background, with white males on free school meals the most striking example of that. So why is this happening? Well, Michael referred to Claire Crawford's work, and if you look at the book she published with Anna Vignoles and others a year or so ago, what they suggest is, especially comparing England with some other countries, there is a particularly strong relationship in this country between socioeconomic background, school attainment, and admission to higher education. So where you come from, where you started from, has a particularly profound effect on your attainment in school, so before you get into higher education. But an attainment is really the dominant factor that drives your admission into HE. So there's a kind of lock chain there that we're all working to try to unpick to a certain extent. I think the other key issue to flag is that the English system is characterised by the importance of choices between different pathways, and choices that are made at a fairly early age. So, I mean, to present this in simplistic terms, around a third of students follow the A-level route when they're around 16, and virtually all of them go on to higher education. Around a third pursue what you might call an applied route, so BTEC and combination of BTEC with other qualifications, and around half of that group goes into HE. And of course, the propensity to take the applied route is much higher for students from low-income backgrounds, and only 5% of those taking the applied route go into the highest tariff universities. There's then another third of students not achieving level 3 at all. That's the case for more than half of students, I think, on free school meals. But for those students, there's an increasingly reducing second chance. So mature student participation in HE is declining substantially. It's more than half since 2011-12. And a lot of that is really about people over 25 who traditionally studied in small bite-sized chunks, which are increasingly less available in higher education. So to conclude on this, we've improved access over the last 20 years, but there's only limited progress to access to the universities that are hardest to reach, those with the highest requirements for entry. Yet that's important because, of course, they provide credentials and connections with significant weight in the world beyond, particularly in the labour market. And that's crucially due to that chain I was talking about, which links together social background, prior attainment, choice of educational pathways, and then the way HE admissions work. Alongside that, it's getting harder to unlock that chain later in life because there are fewer opportunities to study as mature students. So if I come back to the marathon, if I come back to Tower Bridge, we've invested in access at a time of expansion. We've kind of burned off the sugar. We've run the easier first half, but we've got the Isle of Dogs and a lot more difficult running to go, and that's going to be the really crucial, harder part for the next phase. If you move on in the student life cycle, and as has been mentioned, there's more emphasis in the world we're moving into now on participation as well as access. That's the way it's framed in the Act. You could say that this is another way in which we've kind of been running the easier first half of the marathon, getting in, focusing strongly on getting in, but not so much on the getting on piece, and I think that has to change into the future. So although you of course make a similar personal and financial investment in higher education, whoever you are and wherever you study, you are less likely to succeed if you're from the most underrepresented group, and indeed from some ethnic minority groups. Entry qualifications, coming back to prior attainment, of course has an effect on this, but so do other time commitments such as work, caring, commuting, and indeed the support you receive and your sense of belonging whilst you're in the university. So we know that although retention rates are very high in this country, and they've held up even given the expansion and diversification of the student body, nearly 1 in 10 students from the most underrepresented groups are now not continuing. We know also that the proportion of students from this group getting a first or a 2-1 is 10 percentage points lower than the highest and the most represented group, and indeed the most profound gaps are for Black and Asian students. And if you look at A-level entry grades, those gaps happen across all grades, and indeed the gap is widening. So we have this challenge around differential outcomes, even once you've kind of tackled the first part about getting in. But of course the run doesn't end there. I've talked already about the value that students place on higher education in its own terms, but they also want it to improve their life chances. That's about insights and friendships and well-being and resilience, but of course also progression into highly skilled and rewarding jobs. Employment prospects are affected by the factors I've talked about already, going right back to school attainment, but also whether you continue and what grades you get in higher education. But they're also affected by time and resources and contacts that are needed, and the experience and know-how that's needed to navigate the jobs market. And we can see that happening even when we normalise for qualifications. So for students from the most underrepresented group, the proportion entering graduate level jobs is 5 percentage points lower after 40 months. And we know that according to work that was done for the IFS, that salary and earnings are around 10% lower, even once all the other factors have been taken into account. So there's a kind of lower return on the time and money you've invested in your higher education there. And that's important for individuals and their families, but it's also important for all of us in terms of unlocking the potential for the students who are participating. So to conclude, higher education has, I think, improved opportunity substantially during the last couple of decades, but we're a long way from equality of opportunity, which is actually the duty that's set out for the Office of Students in the Higher Education Act. And that's not just about access, it's about student success and student progression. I do, though, think we can tackle this, but we will have to run those harder miles in the second half. And there are 3 key themes that I'd flag a part of that. So firstly, as has been talked about, acquisition, raising attainment in schools, but also recognising potential, not just grades within admissions, and crucially supporting transition into HE, particularly during that crucial period just before HE and during that first year. Secondly, enabling a genuinely informed choice of academic and technical routes into higher education for students from all backgrounds and at different points of their lives. And thirdly, really facing up to differential outcomes in a way we perhaps haven't done before, and taking positive action within universities to address them. And some of that is about individual support, targeted support, but some of it is about the nature of the learning environment and developing inclusive learning cultures and environments in universities. That's really what's needed to achieve the significant reduction in the gaps that Michael and I have both talked about, which relate not just to access, success, and progression, and that needs to happen in individual universities, but also across the sector as a whole. So I'm just going to finish off by talking a bit about the OFS. It's about 3 weeks old, and it might be useful for me to talk a bit about how we're going to work, what the expectations are on us, and how that will flow through to how we'll work with universities and colleges, but also other key parties represented here. So this agenda is absolutely front and centre for the Office for Students. It's the first objective we've set out in the regulatory framework, which we published at the end of February. The first objective says that all students from all backgrounds should be supported to access, succeed and progress from higher education, particularly the most disadvantaged. So that's a kind of starting point for our work. It's also the first condition of registration. So if you're a university wanting to charge the higher fee, you have to negotiate an access and participation plan with the Office for Students, essentially setting out what you're going to do to narrow those gaps that I've been talking about. We published guidance on the plans alongside the regulatory framework at the end of February, and that tries to articulate the way in which we'll work as a combination of pressure and support. So pressure through the way in which we set guidance and assess access and participation plans. In other areas of OFS's work, we talk about a baseline into the system. Here, the baseline includes improvement. So we're expecting everybody who wants a plan and wants to be able to charge the higher fee to demonstrate that they will have a plan to reduce gaps in access, success and progression between groups who are underrepresented at different points of the life cycle and others, but also crucially, reflecting on some of the things that were said in the last session, improving practice. And that crucially is about better use of evidence and evaluation to target work, to refresh and refine it, to understand its impact, and more sustained and in-depth collaboration. And schools is a key sphere for that, building on work over the last decade or so. But I'm also interested in how that collaboration can be with employers, reflecting on the progression issue, and indeed the reductions we've seen in mature student participation. So we see that collaboration piece working across both ends. We'll also, though, alongside the pressure, aim to provide support for the sector, and probably more in this area than any other area of our work. And key areas of that will be the availability and use of more common and rigorous data and evidence than might have been the case before, and the development and sharing of effective practice. We do plan to commission what we call an evidence and impact exchange, which will be a national focal point for that, and we'll tender for that in the coming months. One of the other opportunities of bringing Offa's work into the new body is also not just to use the plans as the only tool to drive this, but to think about how it links with funding. And we've mentioned already the National Collaborative Outreach Programmes, but also other areas of activity. So, for example, the information and advice that's given to students, the assessment of quality, how do we make sure that that captures the pursuit of successful outcomes for students from all backgrounds. Also, a key job for the OFS is to open up the system, to bring in new providers, to remove barriers to novel forms of provision like apprenticeships, for example, that might work flexibly with groups that are hard to reach, including particularly mature students. Another key issue for the OFS, if you look at our duties, is value for money. And that's very pertinent to the work we're doing here. So we still don't know enough about the effectiveness of the different forms of investment and activity in this space. So we'll be interested in how we focus on not just what we spend, but what we're achieving. Better use of evidence, as I've talked about, so we can be more confident that the investment is having the intended effect, and not just getting in access, but also getting on success and progression. So we've made some of these changes already. We'll make more next year. I think it's crucial, having said all of this, to frame the new body as a new body with new duties. It's not just merging HEFCE and Offa and doing the same things. And there are 4 key changes, really. More focus on student success and progression, not just access. More focus on what's actually achieved in terms of reducing the gaps, not just investment. Better tools for the job, so we have different powers and we can use different levers beyond just the access plans, and more support and direction on data, on evidence and evaluation. I'm really looking forward to working with you on this. People keep saying to me that this is the most important area we're working on in the OFS, and if we can make progress on it, it'll be the most important thing we do. So I hope together we'll be able to run right to the end of the race. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. If you don't mind, I'll answer a couple of questions. That'd be great.
Yeah.
So, come take a seat here. same system that we almost used for Michael. If we could have name your institution and lead with your question. I should probably go first and say my name is Sam Holmes and I'm Director of Programmes at Causeway Education. Apologies for not introducing myself earlier. So any questions? We've got some roving microphones that will come round. Any questions? Got one at the front here. Just speak louder. We've got a microphone just coming. Yeah.
Thank you, that was excellent. Rob Challis, I'm an independent consultant in this sector and philanthropy generally. You mentioned, Michael mentioned earlier about the obviously focusing on particularly difficult backgrounds, challenging backgrounds of these children. You brought in the ethnicity dynamic. How are you going to do that in terms of differentiating that from the generic backgrounds that you're looking at in terms of widening participation?
Brilliant. And we'll just take one more question, then answer both of them if that's all right. So any further questions? One at the back. Doug. So how are you going to...
Hello, Doug Jennings from the University of Bristol. One of the priorities that you mentioned, Chris, was around recognising potential within the admissions system. We use a contextual admissions process, which we're very proud of and we think is having a real impact for us. One of the negative points about contextual admissions is essentially accepting students with lower grades can have an impact on tariff score, having an impact on league table position and on recruitment. One of the things which would be incredibly useful is a national approach to this, because clearly tariff reduction is a relative process, and if everybody was doing the same thing, then it wouldn't have an impact. And I was just wondering whether you think there's a space for the OFS to be leading on this and to be leading on this.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Doug. So we come to the first question from Rob Challis on...
So if you look at the regulations that were approved in Parliament for this work, it talks broadly about underrepresented groups. And then it explains that that means underrepresented on access, but not just access, also in relation to continuation and attainment and progression. So we have a very broad remit. We have taken that remit, and in publishing our guidance at the end of February, we published about 6 priorities, which are an analysis of the national data. And they flag, for example, an ambition to improve entry rates for the lowest socioeconomic groups. And then mature students in relation to access. But when we get into student success and progression, we bring ethnicity strongly into play, because we can see very clearly from the analysis what we call unexplained gaps in continuation and attainment and progression. So happening very strongly even when you take entry grades and indeed exit grades in relation to progression into account. And of course those things intersect. And we've provided guidance on the use of multiple equality measures, for example, and targeting around all of that. But I do think there's a particular space for ethnicity in relation to student success and progression, and that is a priority for us, and that sits with the remit we've been given by Parliament. If I move on to the second question, so yes, a really interesting point. Been said to me very clearly over the last couple of months that the way in which tariff points play into league tables is a key challenge in working against unlocking that chain that I was talking about the link between background, preschool attainment and admissions. We do think one of the benefits of bringing Offer and HEFCE together is you can bring the data capability that HEFCE has had for a long time to bear on this agenda, and we ought to be able to suggest other ways in which league tables might work and to engage actively. And I know others like UCAS are interested in this as well, with league table suppliers about this. We also think we will publish our own data much more actively than might have been the case before. A number of people have said to me, listen, if you really want to make progress on this in universities, you've got to make it matter as much as the National Student Survey and the Teaching Excellence Framework and the research measures. So we've got to think about ways of ourselves using data to make that the case, using it publicly, but also advocating that with others. So I do, in a sense, you're saying, is this part of your agenda? And I think we think it is, yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes. You have a mic just coming over here. Thanks.
Thank you for, that was loud, I apologise. Thank you for your presentation. My name's Nasser, and I'm here from Nottingham Trent University. My question links to a topic not mentioned, I don't think, explicitly, but classification inflation, so the increasing number of students receiving 2-1s and firsts, and how that might interact with the positive action you mentioned linked to differential progression.
Okay, so I mean, that's a question that's been raised with me quite a bit. So the OFS wears a quality and standards hat, working with the QAA, and through that it will gain assurance or seek assurance around standards and of course data on changing grading patterns relative to entry grading patterns is a key piece that the OFS will use in that space and could trigger further investigation through the regulatory powers. Grade inflation is also demonstrating student success not achieved through means other than grade inflation is one of the issues that the previous minister brought into play in the Teaching Excellence Framework. So there is a kind of clear regulatory space around standards for the OFS. What I'm highlighting is not absolute increases, but reducing the gaps. So I want to know why some students, even given their entry qualifications, have lower attainment than others. So that's a relative issue rather than an absolute issue. Universities will decide what strategies they will use to address that. But I think what we're looking at is identifying and acknowledging much more explicitly that these gaps are happening and taking action to address that. And I don't think that necessarily requires grade inflation. It requires a systematic look at what's happening for different groups of students and how they're being supported.
Any further questions? Yes, at the back here, Grace.
Hi, I'm Grace, Outreach Manager at the Royal Veterinary College. Thank you very much. I definitely enjoyed the marathon parallel. The question I've got is, I noticed early years were mentioned in the Access and Participation Plan guidance, and I was really interested in your views on the importance of partnership for primary, particularly with relevance to HE.
Yeah, so one of the tensions, in a sense, what I've depicted is a world in which we put much more focus on what's actually being achieved in terms of outcomes. And we're going to produce clearer data and scrutinise more strongly what each individual university is doing in relation to access, success and progression. Clearly that can be in tension with doing work that doesn't benefit you. And that's true. The further you go down the pipeline and the more you're engaged in kind of dispassionate outreach activities. And I'm absolutely clear that needs to continue to happen. And so I think as we change and reform the plans, we'll be interested in how we distinguish between work that you all do as a kind of public good contribution, which will be supporting students who may take all sorts of different pathways, either into different institutions in HE or indeed elsewhere. And there are intelligent ways in which we can track outreach interventions to understand those kind of positive destinations. And I want to regulate for all of that to still happen, and I think we probably do need to regulate for all of that still to happen. But then probably think separately about all the work that happens through access plans like bursaries and student success and progression, which is really about supporting your own students. And we need both to happen, I think, if we're going to succeed.
Thank you very much.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yes.
Caroline Boswell, Education Consultant. You mentioned the big drop-off in mature students, which is really concerning, I think, if we have a vision of lifelong learning and the value of that. What thoughts have you had about what you can do in that area and also links with FE? I know from my own work, with particular groups like Looked After Children, particular other groups, vulnerable groups, FE is the real lifeline, really, in terms of opportunity. What could you be doing in that sort of area, do you think?
So I think we're interested in how what way in which we work with the system itself will bring in and support providers who have often been seen as non-traditional. So if you look at the new providers that are coming in, and I spoke to a group of about 40 of them on Friday, many of them are more than half mature students, and they do have more flexible models, different staffing and delivery structures. So they're thinking differently about how they reach out to mature student populations. And of course the further education colleges are also in that space. So one of the things the OFS will be thinking about as the kind of system regulator is how we enable that kind of more flexible provision to grow and thrive. There are other key things in this space. So one is degree apprenticeships and higher level apprenticeships. There's massive potential in the apprenticeship levy to support workforce development. If we can make more progress in swifter take-up and development of degree apprenticeships, so I think they play a key role. There is also, this will be a strong theme in the post-18 finance review, looking hard at what is needed actually to support mature students who are generally, genuinely price sensitive in a way that the young student population hasn't so much been around fees. If I take my particular remit, I'm conscious that access agreements have had, I think about half of access agreements have had targets for improving mature student population, but that just hasn't been achieved. I mean, you need to look at the data to see how that's not achieved. So one question for me is, and in parallel to that, HEFGE has provided extra funding for part-time study as well. So one question for me is how we might link together, the genuine and successful pursuit of targets with the funding and really work with a group of institutions to achieve that.
Thanks a lot. If you just join me in thanking Chris one more time.
Thank you very much.